Redditors, what was the moment you decided to take down your corrupt company?
My name is Patrick. I'm 28 years old and I'm posting here because I need to get this off my chest, and maybe, just maybe, someone will understand or even be able to help me. For now, let's just say I worked at a company for several years. Let's call it TechCo. I dedicated my time, energy, and skills to this place. I was always one of the first to arrive and the last to leave. I went above and beyond in every project I was assigned, and I never questioned the system. Why would I? I thought the management had everything under control. Boy, was I wrong. Over the years, I started noticing some cracks in the system. There was the usual corporate favoritism, where certain people got promotions simply because they kissed up to the right people. But I didn't mind too much. After all, I was doing my job, and I had faith that merit would eventually be recognized. Things started to take a turn when a colleague of mine, let's call him Ben, was promoted to a managerial role. Ben had absolutely no experience. He was lazy, disorganized, and his knowledge of the industry was, well, let's just say lacking. But somehow, he got promoted over several hardworking employees who had been with the company much longer. It didn't sit right with me, but I still believed in the system. Then, it got worse. Ben started to sabotage my work. He'd take credit for things I did, change my projects without informing me, and make decisions that directly affected my responsibilities. I'd bring this up to my superiors, but they brushed it off. Or worse, they'd say I was being overly sensitive. It felt like I was losing control over everything I'd worked for. But the real punch came when I was blamed for something I didn't do. A massive error occurred on a project, a mistake that could have been avoided if Ben had done his job properly. Instead, I was the scapegoat. I was called into an office meeting with my manager, and in that moment, I knew what was happening. They were going to fire me, and they were going to do it with no real justification. And they did. I was fired. No severance. No chance to explain myself. Just a one-line email telling me I was no longer needed. They told me it was due to performance issues. But the truth is, I was thrown under the bus for something Ben had caused. That was the last straw for me. I spent years believing in fairness and the idea that hard work would pay off. I spent years being loyal to a company that didn't give a damn about me. Now, I'm here to tell my story. I won't sit back and let them get away with it. I'm going to make them pay, but not in the way they'd expect. This post is just the beginning. The first few days after I was fired were a blur. I went through a whirlwind of emotions: anger, disbelief, and a deep sense of betrayal. I couldn't wrap my head around how they could throw me away so easily. I had given that company my all, and this is how they repay me. It didn't sit well, and I knew deep down I wasn't just going to let this slide. I started thinking about my options. For a while, I was too upset to even leave the house, but eventually I snapped out of it. I wasn't the first person to be treated unfairly at TechCo, and I sure as hell wasn't going to be the last. So I did what anyone with a burning sense of injustice would do. I began to plan. I reached out to some of my old colleagues who had also been unfairly treated, especially those who had been around long enough to see the company's dirty secrets. To my surprise, many of them had been quietly building evidence of the corruption and mismanagement within TechCo. Some of them had been documenting the unethical practices of Ben, the promotions based on favoritism, and even financial irregularities that no one dared to speak up about. It was clear that the company had been hiding a lot under the surface, and my firing had been just the tip of the iceberg. But I wasn't interested in just venting or whining about it. I was going to make them pay, and I was going to do it the right way. That's when I started gathering intel. I wasn't looking to get revenge on a personal level, but I was after something bigger. I wanted to expose them for everything they were. I spent hours online searching for ways to bring corporate giants like TechCo to their knees. I dug through their financial reports, searched for any legal loopholes, and even discovered that the company had been avoiding taxes through some creative bookkeeping. The more I found out, the angrier I became. They had been treating me, and countless others, like disposable assets. But this wouldn't be the end of the story. If I was going to go down, I'd make sure they did too. I reached out to a few journalists I knew who were passionate about corporate corruption. I didn't reveal too much about myself, of course. I had to stay anonymous. But I sent them tips, small pieces of information that, when put together, would paint a devastating picture of what was really happening at TechCo. Meanwhile, I kept in touch with my old colleagues. Some of them were even willing to go public, but I told them to hold back for now. There was no rush. The time would come, and it would come hard. The key to my plan was patience. I needed to be strategic. One wrong move could destroy everything, so I had to make sure I had all the pieces in place before making my move. I was no longer the employee who blindly followed orders. I wasn't going to sit idly by and let these corporate vultures destroy any more lives. I was going to take them down, and I'd do it from the inside out. I knew I had to start small. It would be too risky to come out swinging without first testing the waters. So I began with something simple, exposing the cracks in the company's foundation. I wasn't going to directly confront them, not yet, but I could make things uncomfortable. I could make them sweat. The first thing I did was anonymous emails. I sent tips to various regulatory bodies, pointing out some of the discrepancies I had uncovered. I didn't drop the bombshell just yet. I wasn't about to send them everything at once, but I knew the company would start to feel the pressure soon enough. The first one went to the local tax authorities, hinting at the creative bookkeeping TechCo had been doing to avoid paying taxes. Then, I moved on to labor rights organizations. They needed to know how the company had been exploiting its workers, misclassifying positions, and underreporting hours worked. It didn't take much, just a few well-placed pieces of information, enough to stir the pot. Then, I turned to a more public approach. I knew the company was hosting a big conference for investors and clients in a couple of weeks, and it would be the perfect opportunity to escalate things. So I anonymously leaked some internal documents, nothing too incriminating yet, but enough to get people asking questions. The documents were about a few questionable deals that TechCo had been involved in. All of a sudden, people were starting to talk, and some of the investors began to pull back. The pressure was mounting, and I was loving it. I spent the next few days watching from the sidelines as things began to unravel. There were sudden, unexpected audits. TechCo's CFO started getting calls from journalists asking about the discrepancies. My old colleagues were texting me, saying how strange everything had gotten. The atmosphere at the company was tense, and Ben was looking more and more nervous with each passing day. He'd made a lot of enemies, especially with the people who had been passed over for promotions, and now he had the added pressure of everything starting to fall apart. I wasn't done though. This was just the opening act. The next step in my plan was a bit bolder. I needed to make the people who mattered really notice. So I did something I'd been planning for a while. I contacted a few industry leaders and key investors, dropping more detailed pieces of the puzzle. I didn't reveal everything, but I made sure to hint at what was really going on behind the scenes. The goal wasn't just to get TechCo's board members to panic, it was to force them to react before they were ready. Things were moving quickly now. The whispers were turning into full-blown discussions, and I could feel the chaos beginning to take hold. And then, the first major result came when TechCo's stock dropped. Investors were starting to question the company's stability, and that was when the fun really began. The tension inside TechCo was palpable now. Every department was on edge, and I could feel the shifts happening in real time. The leaks I'd orchestrated were starting to gain momentum, and I could see the ripple effect they were causing. People who had once turned a blind eye to the company's darker practices were now becoming more vocal. The investors were nervous, the executives were scrambling, and the media was starting to ask real questions. But I wasn't going to stop there. The real game changer was coming, and I had everything set up perfectly. I had gathered enough evidence to completely destroy the company's reputation. This wasn't just about taking down one corrupt manager anymore. This was about showing the world the rot at the heart of the entire corporation. It was time to go for the jugular. I reached out to a journalist I trusted, one who had always been interested in stories about corporate corruption. I knew she had the connections to get this into the right hands. So I dropped the bomb: financial fraud, tax evasion, and illegal practices that went straight to the top. I gave her the documents, the receipts, and everything she needed to blow the lid off this operation. It was meticulous, everything was carefully organized, and the documents were damning, but I wasn't done yet. While I waited for her to work her magic, I had one last move to make. TechCo's annual investor meeting was coming up, and this was my golden opportunity to make sure the story reached the highest possible audience. I made sure to contact some of the larger clients as well, anonymously of course, and hinted that there were major financial irregularities within the company. I wanted them to feel the heat before the public did. I wasn't going to let them get away with just a scandal here or there. I wanted full, widespread exposure. The day of the meeting arrived, and by then, the storm had already begun to break. As I expected, the media picked up the story. The financial press, the tech blogs, and even mainstream news outlets started running with it. Headlines screamed about TechCo's massive tax evasion scheme, fraudulent deals with shell companies, and the systemic mismanagement of funds. It was the kind of scandal that shook the industry to its core. Meanwhile, I watched from the sidelines as the company tried to react. The executives were in full damage control mode. They issued half-hearted denials and tried to blame rogue employees for the mistakes, but the evidence was overwhelming. It was clear to everyone that TechCo had been operating in a criminal manner for years. And as more and more details came to light, the stock price took another dive. He was nowhere to be found. I imagine he was either too busy trying to cover his tracks or trying to avoid the media vultures, but either way, he was finished. He had been an integral part of the company's downward spiral, and now there was no escaping the truth. In the aftermath of it all, I felt a rush of satisfaction. It wasn't just about getting revenge anymore. It was about holding these people accountable for the harm they caused. TechCo was a sinking ship, and I had made sure that the world knew exactly who was to blame. The fallout from the scandal was fast and brutal. Within hours of the story breaking, TechCo was under investigation from multiple regulatory bodies. The SEC was looking into the financial discrepancies, labor unions were organizing protests, and former employees began filing lawsuits. The company's reputation, which had once been built on hollow promises, was in tatters. I watched from the sidelines as everything I had orchestrated played out. The first significant casualty was the CFO, who was swiftly fired and escorted out of the building in disgrace. Ben, my old nemesis, was next. He had tried to weather the storm by hiding behind his boss's skirts, but when the media uncovered his involvement in several shady deals, it was game over. He was fired on the spot, his name dragged through the mud, and it wasn't long before his incompetence was exposed for the world to see. The company tried to salvage what it could, but it was like trying to patch a sinking ship with duct tape. The employees who had remained loyal were now jumping ship, either resigning or finding new jobs with other companies that weren't under fire. TechCo's stock continued to plummet, and within weeks, its market value had decreased by nearly 40%. It wasn't just the executives who faced consequences. The ripple effect of the scandal reached deep into the ranks of middle management. Many of the managers who had turned a blind eye to the wrongdoing or who had actively participated in the cover-ups were fired. Some faced legal action, with lawsuits mounting against them for their role in perpetuating the culture of corruption. Meanwhile, my old colleagues were taking action too. Some of them had already been in touch with lawyers to file wrongful termination lawsuits. I helped a few of them gather evidence, even providing key details that helped strengthen their cases. One of my colleagues, who had been unfairly passed over for promotion multiple times, sued the company for discrimination and won a settlement. Others followed suit, and TechCo's legal department was overrun with cases. I had no illusions that this was going to be an easy win. TechCo fought back as best as it could, but it was clear the company was crumbling. I was sitting in a cafe one morning when I got a message from one of my former colleagues. He told me that a group of employees had started a workers' rights organization dedicated to supporting people who had been exploited by TechCo. They were using the money from their lawsuits to fund the initiative, and it was gaining traction. It felt good to know that something positive was coming out of all this destruction. The best part? I had managed to do all of this without anyone knowing my identity. The corporate vultures never suspected that the person who had brought them down was the very same guy they had thrown out without a second thought. I had been careful, keeping my distance from the mess I had created, making sure not to leave any trace behind. As the dust began to settle, I reflected on what had transpired. Was this truly justice? It felt like it. I had taken back control over my life, exposed a corrupt system, and, most importantly, I had done it on my own terms. I'd shown them that you don't always have to follow the rules to win, you can break the system if you play it right. I updated my Reddit post with one final message to everyone who's been wronged by a company or boss. You don't have to take it, stand up, fight back, and make them regret ever crossing you. As the months went by, I watched TechCo continue to unravel. The company had never fully recovered from the scandal. It had been forced to lay off thousands of employees and cut many of its operations. The board members had been replaced, and the company's leadership was in complete disarray. TechCo became a cautionary tale in the business world, a textbook example of how corporate corruption can bring even the mightiest companies to their knees. But the most unexpected twist came when I received a letter. It was from my former manager, Karen, the same woman who had treated me like a cog in a machine, dismissing my ideas and belittling me for simply asking for fair treatment. Her handwriting was elegant, the paper thick and formal. It felt strange to see her name on the letterhead, like a ghost from the past. I hesitated before opening it, but I did. The letter started with a formal greeting, something cold and distant, but the tone quickly shifted. I know you're the one behind it all, Karen wrote. The leaks, the whistleblowing, everything. I don't know what you've gained from this, but I do know what you've done to all of us who had to clean up the mess you made. My career is over, my reputation is ruined, and for what? So you could play a game of revenge, she went on, pouring out her bitterness, her resentment, and a deep sense of betrayal. She accused me of ruining the lives of innocent people, of destroying something that was already falling apart. But then, at the end of the letter came the unexpected part. I should have been more aware. You were right to expose them. I was complicit in a system that was rotten to the core. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I am acknowledging that you did what needed to be done. The company was corrupt and we all knew it, but we were too scared to do anything about it. I don't know if this makes any sense, but thank you for making us see the truth. I sat back in my chair feeling a strange mix of emotions. This wasn't the outcome I had anticipated. I thought I'd feel victorious, maybe vindicated. But in this moment, I felt different. The anger had subsided, replaced by a more nuanced feeling. Yes, the system had been corrupt, and yes, I had exposed it. But was that enough? Did I need to hurt so many people to make them see the truth? I wasn't sure. The satisfaction of revenge, of justice, felt hollow when it came at such a high cost. Sure, I had taken down a corporate giant, but was it worth the collateral damage? The truth was, I'd won, but I hadn't expected to feel so empty in the process. Maybe I had crossed a line I hadn't been ready for. Maybe it wasn't about revenge after all. It was about the people I had left behind in the rubble. The last thing Karen had written stuck with me. We were all complicit, but we were also all victims. I realized then that, in some ways, we had all been part of the same broken system. I didn't reply to her letter, but I did take a long, hard look at what I had done. In the end, I hadn't just exposed the corruption at TechCo. I had exposed the ugliness inside myself too.